screams shattered the winter silence of 1342, tearing through the frosted pines of the Whispering Ridge. A lowly servant, frail and destined for nothing, threw her battered body over a crying heir. 8 separate times, cold steel pierced her flesh. 8 times she refused to let go. When her vision finally faded into darkness, she expected the icy embrace of death. Instead, she opened her eyes to the golden, predatory stares of the most powerful rulers in the kingdom. Winter in the Northern Territories was a cruel master, but for an Omega in the Ashbourne pack, it was a daily executioner. Clara Harding knew her place. Born to a disgraced lineage, she was the lowest of the low, a creature meant to scrub the flagstones of the great keep, tend to the fires she was never allowed to sit by, and eat the scraps left behind by the betas and alphas. At 20 years old, her hands were already calloused, her shoulders perpetually bowed in submission, and her spirit ground into a fine, silent dust. The Ashbourne stronghold was a massive fortress of gray stone, ruled by the fearsome Alpha, Cedric Harrington. Lord Harrington was a man of ruthless pragmatism and chilling authority. His word was law, his strength absolute, and his lineage the only thing that mattered. His sole heir, a 5-year-old boy named Leo, was the crown jewel of the pack, the future Alpha whose existence ensured the stability of their borders against the encroaching rogue factions. It was a bleak Tuesday afternoon when the tragedy struck. Clara had been tasked with gathering winterberries on the fringes of the pack's territory, a dangerous errand usually reserved for armed patrols, but Lady Genevieve Croft, Cedric's betrothed and a high-ranking beta, had ordered it done by sunset. Clara knew better than to argue. She waded through snowdrifts that reached her knees, her ragged wool cloak offering no protection against the biting wind. Unbeknownst to Clara, young Leo had slipped away from his handlers. The boy, possessing the reckless curiosity of a growing wolf, had chased a snow hare past the protective wards of the stronghold. Clara heard him before she saw him, a sharp, terrified gasp echoing through the skeletal birch trees. She dropped her basket. Instinct, raw and unbidden, propelled her forward. Clara burst through a thicket just in time to see 3 massive scarred men cornering the child. They were rogues, packless wolves driven mad by isolation, their eyes feral and their clothing tattered. The leader, a hulking brute named Garrow, drew a jagged hunting knife, stepping toward the shivering boy. "The Harrington brat," Garrow sneered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The Alpha will weep blood tonight." Leo squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a whimper. Clara did not think. She did not calculate the odds, nor did she remember her absolute lack of combat training. She was an Omega, hardwired to submit, yet an inexplicable surge of maternal ferocity overrode her genetics. With a guttural cry, Clara lunged. She collided with Garrow just as his arm descended. The momentum sent them both crashing into the snow. Garrow roared in surprise and fury, backhanding Clara with enough force to shatter her jaw. She tasted copper instantly, her vision swimming, but she scrambled backward, placing herself squarely between the towering rogues and the weeping child. "Run, Leo! Run to the keep!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing her throat. The boy stumbled backward and began to sprint toward the fortress, his small legs pumping through the deep snow. "Kill her!" Garrow barked to his men. "Get the boy!" The first blade caught Clara in the right shoulder. It was a searing, white-hot agony that stole the breath from her lungs. A rogue had lunged past her guard, burying a dagger to the hilt. Clara screamed, but did not fall. She grabbed the man's wrist, sinking her teeth into his bare arm with the desperation of a cornered animal. He howled, ripping the blade free and plunging it into her ribs. 2. She fell to her knees, the snow beneath her rapidly blooming crimson. Garrow stepped forward, his eyes devoid of mercy. He kicked her squarely in the chest, sending her sprawling onto her back. Clara fought to keep her eyes open, turning her head to ensure Leo was still running. He was almost at the tree line, just a few more seconds. She just needed to buy him a few more seconds. Garrow's jagged knife descended, piercing her thigh. 3. Another rogue slashed across her abdomen. 4. A brutal stab to her collarbone. 5. Clara's hands weakly gripped Garrow's boots, her blood-slicked fingers refusing to release him. "You will not pass," she choked out, blood bubbling past her lips. Enraged by the sheer defiance of this broken creature, Garrow drove his blade into her lower back as she twisted. 6. 7. The 8th blade pierced the space just below her heart. The pain eclipsed everything, transforming into a strange, terrifying numbness. The sounds of the forest faded, the crunching snow, the cursing men, the distant howling of the Ashbourne guards who had finally heard the commotion. As the massive wolves of the pack patrol burst through the trees, tearing into the rogues with unrestrained fury, Clara lay dying in the red snow. Her final thought was not of her miserable life, nor of the pack that despised her, but of the little boy's golden eyes filled with fear, now safely vanished into the woods. She let out a soft, shuddering breath and let the darkness take her. Death, Clara decided, was surprisingly warm. It smelled of burning cedar, crushed lavender, and old parchment. It was also remarkably soft. When she finally managed to pry her heavy eyelids open, the blinding glare of sunlight forced her to close them again with a groan. Her throat felt like it was coated in sand. "She stirs." The voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a voice Clara had heard only a handful of times in her life, usually booming from the high balcony of the courtyard to command the pack. It was the voice of Alpha Cedric Harrington. Clara forced her eyes open, blinking rapidly to clear the blurriness. She was not in the drafty, hay-lined Omega barracks. She was lying in a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy crimson silks and thick fur pelts. The room was cavernous, heated by a roaring hearth large enough to roast an ox. Tapestries bearing the Ashbourne crest, a snarling wolf entwined with brambles, hung from the stone walls. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, localized ache in her chest forced her back down with a sharp gasp. "Do not move, Clara Harding." Cedric Harrington stepped out of the shadows. He was a terrifyingly handsome man in his early 30s, standing 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His dark hair was tied back with a leather strap, and his piercing golden eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that made Clara's Omega instinct scream at her to bare her neck in submission. She instantly tried to roll out of the bed to kneel. "My Alpha," she croaked, panicking. I am sorry. I shouldn't be here. I don't know how I—" A heavy, calloused hand pressed gently against her uninjured shoulder, keeping her pinned to the mattress. It was not Cedric who touched her, but an older woman standing beside the bed. Maud, the pack's chief healer. "Still your heart, child," Maud said gently, though her eyes held a mixture of awe and bewilderment. "You have been unconscious for 4 days. You suffered 8 puncture wounds, 2 punctured lungs, and severe blood loss. By all laws of nature and the goddess, you should be a corpse." Clara stared at her, her mind racing. "Leo, the boy?" "My son is safe," Cedric said, his voice lowering an octave, heavy with an emotion Clara could not decipher. He stepped closer to the bed, pulling up a wooden chair and sitting down. The sheer proximity of the Alpha made the air crackle with static energy. "Because of you, the guards found you holding Garrow's boot, bleeding out in the snow, while Leo crossed the wards. You saved my heir, Omega." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the lavish room. I only did what I had to, my lord. Please, I can return to the kitchens. I don't want to soil your linens." Cedric let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "You will not be returning to the kitchens, Clara, nor to the barracks." Before Clara could process that statement, the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber swung open. Lady Genevieve Croft glided into the room. She was a vision of aristocratic perfection, with long, icy blonde hair, porcelain skin, and sharp, calculating blue eyes. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, the fabric whispering against the stone floor. Though her face was set in a mask of polite concern, Clara could smell the acrid scent of ozone and bitter almonds radiating from her. The scent of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Ah, the little martyr is awake," Genevieve said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. She stepped up beside Cedric, placing a possessive hand on his broad shoulder. "We were so worried. Weren't we, Cedric, darling? It is truly a miracle the poor thing survived." "It is no miracle, Genevieve," Maud muttered under her breath, wrapping a fresh linen bandage around Clara's wrist. "It is the Alpha's blood." Clara froze. She looked at Maud, then at Cedric, her eyes widening in horror and realization. The Alpha's blood? In werewolf lore, an Alpha's blood was a sacred, potent thing. It had incredible regenerative properties, but it was strictly forbidden to share it with anyone outside of one's direct mate or bloodline. For an Alpha to feed their blood to an Omega, it was unheard of. It broke the fundamental laws of their hierarchy. It bound them. "You were dying," Cedric stated flatly, holding Clara's terrified gaze. "The healer's herbs were useless. Your heart had stopped. I owed you a life for the life of my son. I gave you my wrist." You fed me your blood?" Clara whispered, her trembling fingers touching her lips. Suddenly, she realized why the room smelled so overwhelmingly vivid. She could smell the pine needles clinging to Cedric's boots, the faint scent of copper on Maud's apron, the bitter poison of Genevieve's perfume. Her senses were sharp, violently awake. The oppressive, soul-crushing weight of her Omega status felt fractured. Genevieve's manicured fingers tightened on Cedric's shoulder. "A temporary measure, of course," she said smoothly, though her eyes were narrowed at Clara like daggers. "Cedric is a generous and honorable Alpha. He could not let a servant die after doing her duty. But now that she is awake, she can be moved to the infirmary to finish her recovery. It isn't proper for a packless Omega to sleep in the Alpha's inner sanctum." "She stays here," Cedric commanded, not even looking at his betrothed. His eyes never left Clara's. "Until she is fully healed, that is my final word." Genevieve stiffened, her jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in her cheek. "As you wish, my lord," she murmured, before spinning on her heel and marching out of the room, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her. Clara lay in the massive bed, her heart hammering against her healing ribs. She had survived 8 blades, but as she looked into the intense, brooding eyes of Alpha Cedric, she realized her true fight for survival had only just begun. A week passed, and Clara's recovery defied all medical logic. The 8 horrific stab wounds, which should have crippled her for months, closed rapidly, leaving behind shiny pink scars that pulsed with a strange warmth. Maud removed the bandages on the 8th day, shaking her head in silent disbelief. The Alpha's blood surging through Clara's veins had not only healed her, it was changing her. Clara felt stronger. The chronic ache in her joints from years of sleeping on damp hay was gone. But more terrifying than her physical recovery was the social upheaval her presence in the inner stronghold was causing. She was confined to a guest suite adjacent to Cedric's own chambers. Elite guards, massive scarred betas who used to completely ignore her existence, now stood at attention when she walked the corridors to the library. They bowed their heads slightly. It was a subtle gesture, but in the rigid hierarchy of the Ashbourne pack, a beta bowing to an omega was equivalent to a mountain bowing to a pebble. "They smell him on you," Maud explained one afternoon as they sat by the fire, Clara sipping a cup of bitter willowbark tea. "I don't understand," Clara said softly, tracing the rim of her cup. Maud sighed, her aged eyes filled with a mixture of pity and caution. "When an alpha gives his blood to save a life, it creates a tie. But you took an immense amount, Clara. He practically drained himself to restart your heart. To the pack's primal instincts, you are no longer just Clara the Omega servant. You carry the Alpha's scent intertwined with your own. Some view you as his ward. Others," she hesitated. "Others what?" "Others view you as a threat to the natural order, especially Lady Genevieve." Clara shivered. She had avoided Genevieve as much as possible, but the beta woman's presence loomed over the keep like a dark thundercloud. Genevieve's family, the wealthy and militant Crofts, controlled the southern trade routes and the winter grain silos. Cedric's impending marriage to Genevieve was a political alliance necessary to keep the pack fed through the brutal winters. Later that evening, Clara felt restless. The walls of her lavish suite felt like a gilded cage. Wrapping a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders, she slipped out into the dimly lit stone corridors. The midnight air was cold, smelling of approaching snow. She walked silently, her bare feet making no sound on the stones. An old habit from her days of trying to remain invisible, she found herself wandering toward the eastern wing, near the war room. As she passed a heavy oak door that was slightly ajar, a familiar scent hit her heightened senses. Bitter almonds and ozone. Genevieve. Clara froze, intending to turn back, when another scent hit her. It was faint, masked heavily by pine oil and strong ale, but it was unmistakable to Clara. Wet fur, rot, and stale iron. It was the scent of the rogue who had stabbed her in the thigh. Her breath hitched. Garrow's men were dead, slaughtered by the patrol. Garrow himself was rumored to have escaped into the mountains, heavily wounded. How could that scent be inside the most secure fortress in the territory? Driven by a terrifying curiosity, Clara pressed her back against the cold stone wall and edged closer to the crack in the door. "You promised he would be dead," Genevieve's voice hissed, devoid of her usual aristocratic polish. It sounded venomous, desperate. "The plan was sound, my lady," a raspy, low voice replied. Clara's blood ran cold. It was one of the rogues. "We drew the guards away. We cornered the brat. We didn't account for the servant girl interfering. She threw herself on the blades like a mad dog." "I do not pay you for excuses, Thorn," Genevieve snarled. "That little bastard Leo is the only thing standing between me and complete control of the Ashbourne lineage. As long as Cedric has an heir, my future children will play second fiddle. He won't even set a date for the mating ceremony until the boy comes of age." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Assassination. The rogue attack wasn't a random border breach. Genevieve had orchestrated it. The future Luna of the pack had paid rogues to murder a 5-year-old child just to secure her own political supremacy. "Garrow is furious," the rogue Thorn growled softly. "He lost 3 men, and he is freezing in a cave with a shattered ribcage. We want the rest of the coin, Lady Croft. Or Garrow might just decide to tell Lord Harrington exactly who left the border wards down last Tuesday." "Are you threatening me, you filthy mongrel?" There was the distinct sound of a blade being drawn from a leather sheath. "I can have you flayed alive and hung from the battlements before the sun rises." "If I die, a letter goes to the Alpha," Thorn replied, unfazed. 50 gold pieces by tomorrow night at the old mill, or the pack learns that their pristine lady is a traitor." A tense, suffocating silence stretched between them. Finally, Genevieve let out a slow, furious breath. "Fine, tomorrow night. But you tell Garrow that if he ever sets foot in my territory again, I will hunt him down myself." Clara had heard enough. Her heart was beating so violently against her ribs, she feared they could hear it. She turned to carefully sneak away, but her trembling foot brushed against a heavy suit of decorative armor standing in the hall. The metal gauntlet clattered loudly against the breastplate. In the dead silence of the hallway, it sounded like a thunderclap. Inside the room, the voices abruptly stopped. "Who's there?" Genevieve barked. Clara didn't wait. She hiked up her heavy nightgown and ran. She tore down the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the frozen stone. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, had to find Cedric. But who would believe her? She was an Omega, a nobody, accusing the most powerful woman in the territory of treason. Footsteps pounded behind her, heavy, fast, and predatory. Thorn was hunting her. Clara rounded a corner, sliding slightly on the slick stones, and collided hard into a solid wall of muscle and heat. Strong arms instinctively wrapped around her, steadying her. She looked up, gasping for air, straight into the glowing golden eyes of Cedric Harrington. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his hair loose around his shoulders. When he looked at Clara, his eyes were soft for a fraction of a second before he inhaled sharply. His nostrils flared, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. He pulled her flush against his chest, a low, terrifying growl rumbling deep in his throat as he glared down the empty hallway she had just fled from. He could smell the terror on her, and he could smell the lingering scent of the rogue pursuing her. "Who?" Cedric demanded, his voice dropping into the ancient, compelling command of an alpha, is hunting what is mine. Cedric's voice did not just echo in the stone corridor. It seemed to command the very air to be still. The overwhelming pressure of his alpha aura slammed into the narrow hallway, a suffocating wave of dominance that forced Clara to her knees, not out of fear, but out of sheer biological reflex. A shadow shifted at the far end of the corridor. The rogue, the man who had been conspiring with Genevieve, stepped into the pale moonlight filtering through a high window. For a fraction of a second, he locked eyes with Cedric. The rogue's face drained of color. He knew he was dead. Without a word, he turned and vaulted out of the open window, plummeting into the snowbanks below to make his desperate escape. Cedric did not give chase. His primary instinct, an ancient and violent drumbeat in his blood, kept him anchored to the trembling woman at his feet. He dropped to one knee, his large hands gripping Clara's shoulders, hauling her against his chest. "You are safe," Cedric rumbled, his chest vibrating against her cheek. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. Clara gasped as his nose brushed the sensitive skin over her scent gland. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, one reserved for mates, yet Cedric seemed completely unaware of the impropriety. He was lost to the wolf, verifying her safety through scent. "He did not touch you. You are unbled." "My lord," Clara stammered, her hands gripping the thick fabric of his tunic. "The rogue, he was not here to hunt me. He was here for his payment from Lady Genevieve." Cedric pulled back slowly. The chaotic darkness in his eyes receded, replaced by the chilling, calculating stare of the alpha who ruled the Northern Territories. "Explain." Standing in the freezing corridor, still clinging to the man who commanded thousands, Clara recounted every word she had heard. She spoke of the assassination plot against little Leo, the lowered border wards, and the meeting set for the old mill to pay off Garrow's surviving mercenaries. When she finished, the silence stretching between them was heavy and lethal. Cedric's face was an unreadable mask of stone, but the air around him crackled with a fury so intense it made Clara's skin prickle. "If you speak falsely, Clara," Cedric said softly, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout, "it is treason. Genevieve is the daughter of Lord Arthur Croft. Her family controls the Winchester Merchant Guild and the Southern Grain Silos. Accusing her of attempting to murder my heir is a declaration of war." "I swear it on my life, Alpha," Clara whispered, meeting his golden gaze without flinching. Before the attack in the snow, she would never have dared to look him in the eye. But the blood singing in her veins gave her a strange, quiet courage. "I would die 1,000 times before I let harm come to Leo. You know this to be true." Cedric stared at her for a long, breathless moment. He saw the truth in her eyes, felt the steady, honest rhythm of her heartbeat through the proximity of their bodies. Slowly, his thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek, a surprisingly tender motion from a man known as the Butcher of the North. "I know," he murmured. "I know you would." He stood up in one fluid motion, pulling her to her feet with him. "You cannot stay in the guest wing. If Genevieve suspects you heard her, she will not hesitate to silence you. From this moment on, you do not leave my side. You sleep in my chambers. You eat from my plate." Clara's eyes widened. "My lord, the pack, what will they say? An Omega in the Alpha's bedchamber." "Let them say what they will," Cedric growled, his hand wrapping securely around hers, his grip hot and possessive. I am the Alpha, and I am tired of allowing vipers to nest in my home. The next morning, the fortress was ablaze with whispered rumors. Lady Genevieve sat at the high table in the great hall, her posture perfectly rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped her silver goblet. She watched with poorly concealed fury as Clara was led into the hall, not by a servant, but by Cedric's personal guard, and seated at a small table directly adjacent to the Alpha's dais. Genevieve leaned toward Cedric, her voice a low, poisonous hiss. What is the meaning of this, Cedric? That creature should be in the scullery. Keeping her paraded before the pack is an insult to me and to the Winchester Merchant Guild that my father so generously uses to supply your boarders. Cedric did not look at her. He calmly sliced his roasted meat, his expression utterly serene. Clara is recovering from grievous wounds sustained in the defense of my son. She is under my personal protection. If her presence offends you, Genevieve, you are free to take your meals in your quarters. Genevieve's jaw clamped shut. She plastered a fake radiant smile on her face as several beta lords looked their way. Of course not, my love. I only worry for her mind. The healers say that an omega taking alpha blood can cause hallucinations, paranoia, blood madness. We must be careful she does not become a danger to herself or to others. It was a brilliant tactical move. Genevieve was laying the groundwork to discredit Clara, ensuring that if the Omega spoke out, the pack would dismiss her as insane. Clara, hearing this with her newly sharpened hearing, felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Genevieve was not just cruel, she was a master of political warfare. Later that afternoon, Cedric summoned his most trusted general, a battle-scarred beta named Gideon. Behind the heavy oak doors of the war room, Cedric briefed him on the impending meeting at the old mill. "We strike tonight," Cedric commanded, pointing to a sprawling map of the territory. "Take 3 of our best trackers. I want the rogue captured alive. He is the proof I need to execute Genevieve and sever ties with the Croft family without inciting a civil war." "And if it is a trap, my lord?" Gideon asked, his scarred brow furrowing. "Then you kill them all," Cedric replied, coldly. "Leave no trace." The old mill sat on the edge of the Ashbourne territory, a rotting husk of timber and waterlogged stone that had been abandoned for a decade. The night was pitch black, heavy clouds obscuring the moon and threatening a massive blizzard. Back at the stronghold, Clara paced the length of Cedric's massive bedchamber. A roaring fire kept the room warm, but Clara felt cold to her bones. Her instincts, amplified by the alpha blood humming in her veins, were screaming at her. A profound sense of dread settled over her shoulders like a lead weight. Cedric sat at his heavy oak desk, reviewing border reports, though his eyes kept tracking Clara's restless movements. "You will wear a hole in the stone, little wolf," he said softly. Clara stopped, wringing her hands. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." "Gideon is my finest warrior," Cedric assured her, standing and crossing the room to stand before her. He towered over her, yet Clara felt only a deep magnetic safety in his presence. "He will secure the rogue. By morning, Genevieve will be in irons, and the threat to Leo will be extinguished." Clara looked up at him, her heart aching with an emotion she dared not name. "She knows, Cedric. She knew I was in the hallway. I felt her looking at me in the great hall today. She looked at me like she had already won. Before Cedric could comfort her, the heavy doors of the chamber burst open. A bloodied, breathless guard collapsed against the doorframe, gasping for air. "Alpha!" the guard choked out. "The armory! Lady Genevieve!" Cedric was across the room in a flash, hauling the man up by his collar. "Speak!" "It was a distraction," the guard coughed, blood spilling from his lips. "She took a contingent of guards loyal to the Croft family. They rode out the southern gate an hour ago. They're heading for the old mill. She knows Gideon is there. She's going to slaughter him and blame it on the rogues to cover her tracks." Cedric's eyes flashed with absolute murderous rage. Genevieve was not going to the mill to pay the rogues. She was going to wipe out everyone who knew her secret, including Cedric's most loyal general, and frame the massacre as a rogue ambush. "Sound the horn!" Cedric roared, his voice cracking like thunder through the keep. "Rouse the cavalry! Anyone loyal to the Ashbourne name rides with me." He turned to Clara, his expression fierce. "Bar the doors. Do not let anyone in until I return. Do you understand?" "Let me come with you," Clara pleaded, grabbing his arm. "I know Garrow's scent. I can track him in the dark. You'll need every advantage." "Absolutely not," Cedric snarled, his protective instincts flaring violently. "You stay here. You stay safe." He tore himself away and vanished into the corridor. Within minutes, the courtyard echoed with the frantic galloping of war horses and the howling of wolves taking their beast forms to run through the snow. Alone in the vast chamber, the silence pressed in on Clara. The dread in her chest did not dissipate, it amplified. She paced toward the window, looking out into the swirling snow. Suddenly, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. A familiar scent drifted under the heavy oak door. Bitter almonds and ozone. Genevieve had not ridden out the southern gate. The door handle rattled. Clara backed away, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The heavy iron lock groaned, then snapped with a sharp crack as someone used brute werewolf strength to break the mechanism. The doors swung open. Genevieve stood there, her elegant gown swapped for dark leather riding clothes, a vicious, curved hunting blade in her hand. Behind her stood two massive men, the rogue who had fled the hallway, and another mercenary. "Did you really think I was stupid enough to go to the mill myself?" Genevieve laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "I sent my father's men to deal with Gideon, but my real prize is right here." Clara backed up until her spine hit the cold stone of the fireplace mantel. "Cedric will kill you for this. He will tear you limb from limb. Cedric is currently riding straight into an ambush orchestrated by the Winchester Merchant Guild's finest mercenaries," Genevieve sneered, stepping into the room and closing the broken doors behind her. "He will die bravely, defending his precious general. And when I return to the pack in mourning, I will tell them the tragic tale of how the blood-mad Omega let the rogues into the keep to slaughter him. As the surviving beta of the highest rank, I will take control of Ashbourne as regent until little Leo comes of age. Though, sadly, the boy might succumb to a terrible fever this winter." "You are a monster!" Clara spat. Genevieve's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, ugly hatred. "I am a survivor. I was bred to rule this pack. I will not let a miserable, dirt-stained Omega and a stubborn Alpha stand in my way." She gestured to the rogues with her knife. "Take her, bleed her slow, let her feel it." The two men advanced, their eyes filled with cruel intent. Clara had no weapons. She had no training. But as the first rogue lunged, reaching for her throat, something inside Clara snapped. It wasn't the submissive instinct of an Omega. It was a roar of heat, born from the 8 drops of alpha blood that had forged a new soul within her broken body. The rogue's hands clamped down on Clara's shoulders, intending to throw her to the stone floor. But he met the resistance of a brick wall. Clara did not budge. A low, guttural growl vibrated in the room. It did not come from the rogues, nor from Genevieve. It came from Clara. Her eyes, usually a soft, unremarkable brown, flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. The rogue had a fraction of a second to register the shock on his face before Clara moved. With a speed that defied logic, she grabbed the man's wrists, twisting them violently backward. The sickening crack of snapping bone echoed through the chamber, followed instantly by his agonized scream. Clara kicked out, driving her heel into his knee, shattering it. As he fell, she grabbed his head and slammed it brutally into the stone mantel. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended on the room, thick and suffocating. Genevieve stared, her mouth slightly open, the color draining from her aristocratic face. The second rogue took a hesitant step backward, his bravado evaporating in the face of the impossible. Omegas did not fight back. They cowered. They submitted. What are you?" Genevieve whispered, her grip tightening nervously on her blade. Clara slowly turned her head toward them. The air around her shimmered with a visible aura of heat. The alpha blood in her veins was boiling, rewriting her biology, tearing away the suppressed, starved layers of her omega shell. For generations, her lineage had been branded as weak, but as the golden light flared in her eyes, an ancient, forgotten truth unlocked within her DNA. She wasn't just an omega, she was a prime, a genetic anomaly, an alpha-born female whose scent and power lay dormant until triggered by near death and the blood of a true mate. "I am the one who took 8 blades in the snow." Clara's voice resonated with a dual timbre, echoing with the raw, terrifying power of the wolf within. "I survived. You will not." The remaining rogue let out a battle cry, drawing a heavy broadsword and lunging at her. Clara didn't try to block the massive weapon. She ducked beneath his wild swing, the steel whistling mere inches over her head. She drove her fist up into his ribcage. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer striking a wooden barrel. The man gasped, dropping his sword as his ribs caved in. Clara grabbed him by the throat, lifting a 200-pound mercenary off the ground with one hand, and hurled him across the room. He smashed into a heavy wooden wardrobe and lay still. Genevieve backed away toward the door, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The arrogant, calculating aristocrat was gone, replaced by a cornered prey animal. "This is impossible," Genevieve breathed, shaking her head. "You are dirt. You are nothing." "I am Ashborn," Clara growled, stepping toward her, each step cracking the stone tiles beneath her bare feet. Genevieve shrieked and thrust her hunting knife forward in a desperate, wild strike. Clara caught her wrist mid-air. The grip was like an iron vice. Genevieve whimpered as Clara squeezed, the bones grinding together until the knife clattered to the floor. Clara shoved Genevieve against the heavy oak doors, her forearm pressing against the beta woman's throat, pinning her in place. The golden fire in Clara's eyes bore into Genevieve's terrified blue ones. Your reign of poison is over, Clara hissed. Suddenly, a massive explosion of sound rocked the courtyard below. The howling of wolves, the clash of steel, and the agonized screams of dying men echoed through the freezing night. Clara's head snapped toward the window. The mate bond, newly awakened and roaring in her blood, pulled her focus like a magnetic compass. Cedric. Miles away at the old mill, Cedric had indeed ridden into a trap. But it wasn't the trap Genevieve had planned. Gideon, suspicious of the open terrain, had not approached the mill directly. When the Winchester mercenaries sprang their ambush, they found themselves completely surrounded by Cedric's elite guard, who had been waiting in the tree line. The slaughter was absolute, but in the chaos, a dying mercenary confessed that Genevieve had stayed behind at the keep. Realizing Clara was unprotected, Cedric had abandoned the skirmish, riding his warhorse to death to return to the stronghold. The courtyard below was now a battlefield. The guards Genevieve had left behind to secure the keep were clashing with Cedric's returning forces. Clara dragged Genevieve away from the door by her hair, ignoring the woman's panicked screams. She hauled her out into the corridor and down the winding stone staircase that led to the main hall, her grip unyielding. The pack members who had hidden from the fighting peered out from their doorways, gasping in shock as they watched the once invisible servant drag the terrifying Lady Croft down the steps like a sack of grain. As Clara reached the ground floor, the heavy iron-bound doors of the great hall blew inward with an explosive force, ripped off their hinges. Cedric Harrington stepped through the splintered wood. He was covered in blood and snow, his chest heaving, his eyes entirely black with the wolf's fury. He held a massive, bloodied broadsword in his right hand. He looked like the god of war, a force of nature ready to tear the very foundations of the castle apart to find his mate. His eyes locked onto Clara. He saw the golden light radiating from her, saw the crushed, terrified form of Genevieve in her grasp, and the air left his lungs. The primal roaring panic in his chest instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering realization. The scent that filled the hall was no longer just the sweet, subservient scent of an omega mixed with his own blood. It was the rich, intoxicating, overwhelmingly powerful scent of a prime alpha female, his equal, his mate. Cedric dropped his broadsword. The heavy steel clanged loudly against the flagstones. He crossed the great hall in 3 massive strides, ignoring Genevieve entirely as Clara released her grip and let the traitorous Beta crumble to the floor weeping. Cedric fell to his knees in front of Clara, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her stomach. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound relief and devotion that it sent shivers down the spines of the watching pack members. "You are safe," he whispered hoarsely into the fabric of her dress. Clara ran her trembling hands through his thick, snow-dampened hair, the golden light in her eyes softening into a warm, radiant glow. "I told you, my alpha," she said softly, "I would die before I let them win." "No," Cedric corrected, looking up at her, his eyes returning to their stunning gold, reflecting her own. "No more dying. From this night forward, you live, and you rule." Genevieve sobbed on the floor, realizing her fate was sealed. The pack guards, having secured the courtyard, poured into the hall, witnessing the undeniable display of power and submission. The Ashbourne pack had found its true Luna, born from blood, forged in ice and destined to reshape their world forever. The dawn that broke over the Ashbourne stronghold the next morning was cold, brilliant, and forever changed. The blood in the courtyard had been washed away by a fresh blanket of snow, but the political landscape of the Northern Territories was irreparably fractured. Genevieve Croft was chained in the damp, lightless depths of the keep's dungeon, her aristocratic arrogance entirely broken. But the true storm had yet to arrive. 3 days later, the horizon darkened. The Winchester Merchant Guild did not take the imprisonment of their heir lightly. Lord Arthur Croft, a ruthless beta whose wealth bought armies, marched on the Ashbourne gates with 500 heavily armed mercenaries. The rumbling of their war drums shook the snow from the pine branches, a deafening promise of a siege that the winter-weary Ashbourne pack could barely withstand. Cedric stood on the battlements, his heavy fur cloak snapping in the biting wind, his golden eyes narrowed at the sea of steel below. Beside him stood Clara. She was no longer dressed in the rough-spun wool of a servant, nor the borrowed silks of a guest. She wore a tailored riding habit of midnight blue, a silver cloak fastened with the snarling wolf of Ashbourne. Her posture was flawless, her spine steel, radiating the undeniable, heavy aura of a prime alpha. "Open the gates!" Lord Arthur's voice boomed over the courtyard, magically amplified by a horn. "You hold my daughter, Harrington. Surrender her, or we burn this fortress to the ground and take our grain with us. Your people will starve before the first thaw." Cedric glanced at Clara. There was no fear in his mate's eyes, only a profound, terrifying calm. "Shall we meet our guest?" Cedric asked softly. "Let him in," Clara replied, her voice carrying a resonant, dual timbre that made the guards around them shiver in respect. "But only him and his lieutenant. If the others cross the ward, they die." Minutes later, the great hall was a theater of absolute tension. Lord Arthur Croft stormed through the heavy oak doors, flanked by his imposing lieutenant, a massive brute named Bennett. Arthur's face was purple with rage. "This is an outrage, Cedric," Arthur spat, his hand resting aggressively on the pommel of his sword. "You accuse my daughter of treason on the word of a filthy, packless Omega? I demand you release her immediately." "I am no longer an Omega, Lord Croft." Clara stepped down from the dais. Her golden eyes flared, and the sheer atmospheric pressure of her prime scent slammed into Arthur and Bennett. Arthur gasped, taking an involuntary step back, his instincts warring violently with his pride. A female prime had not been seen in a century. "Bring her up," Cedric commanded Gideon. Genevieve was dragged into the hall, her velvet dress ruined, her hair a matted mess. Seeing her father, she burst into theatrical tears. "Father, they tortured me. They framed me. Cedric has lost his mind to this beast." Arthur's face softened for a fraction of a second, but before he could speak, Clara raised a hand. "Your daughter is a traitor, Arthur," Clara said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "But she did not just betray Ashbourne. She betrayed the Winchester Guild." Genevieve froze, her sobbing instantly cutting off. "Lies!" she shrieked, panic pitching her voice an octave higher. "When we captured the rogues at the old mill," Cedric interjected, his tone deadly, "we did not just find mercenaries. We found ledgers. Your daughter wasn't just paying them to assassinate my son. She was paying them to secure the southern passes." Clara locked eyes with Arthur. "She wasn't dealing with simple packless wolves. She was dealing with Harrison Caldwell, The name dropped into the great hall like a live grenade. Harrison Caldwell was the most notorious smuggler in the territories, a ruthless warlord who had spent the last decade trying to dismantle the Winchester Merchant Guild's monopoly on the grain trade. "No," Arthur whispered, his face draining of blood. He looked at Genevieve, his eyes widening in horror. "Tell me you did not bargain with Caldwell." I had to," Genevieve cried, crawling toward her father, the chains rattling against the stone. "Cedric wouldn't set a date. I needed leverage. Caldwell promised me an army to take Ashbourne, and in exchange, I only promised him the southern toll roads. It was for our family, Father." Arthur Croft stared at his daughter as if looking at a venomous snake. Giving Caldwell the southern toll roads would have bankrupted the Winchester Guild within a year. Genevieve had been willing to destroy her own father's empire just to wear the Luna's crown. "Bennett," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly flat. "Did you know of this?" The massive lieutenant swallowed hard, looking between Arthur and the glowing, predatory eyes of Clara. The Prime's aura forced the truth from his lips. She paid me in guild gold to keep the ledgers hidden, my lord." In a blur of motion, Arthur drew his sword and drove the hilt into Bennett's jaw, sending the massive man crashing to the floor unconscious. He then sheathed his weapon and looked down at his weeping daughter. "You are no Croft," Arthur said coldly, the ultimate declaration of disownment. He turned to Cedric and Clara, dropping to one knee and bowing his head. "The Winchester Guild formally apologizes to the Ashbourne Pack. We withdraw our protection of this woman. Do with her what you will. Our grain shipments will continue, at half price, as penance." Genevieve screamed as the guards dragged her away. She was not executed. Cedric and Clara agreed that death was too easy a release for a woman so obsessed with power. Instead, she was stripped of her wolf through an ancient binding ritual and banished to the Deadlands, a human exile forced to survive in the very wilderness she had weaponized against others. Months later, the harsh northern winter finally broke, giving way to a vibrant, blooming spring. The Whispering Ridge was alive with the scent of pine and wild lilies. The courtyard of the Ashbourne stronghold was completely transformed. Gone was the grim, oppressive atmosphere of a military fortress. Festivities were in full swing, banners of blue and silver catching the warm breeze. It was the day of the official mating ceremony. Clara stood on the balcony overlooking the celebrations. She wore a stunning gown of silver silk, her dark hair woven with white winter roses. The scars from the 8 blades were still there beneath the fabric, shiny silver marks of honor that Cedric kissed with religious devotion every night. "Mother," Clara turned just in time to catch a small golden-haired missile. Little Leo collided with her skirts, giggling uncontrollably. He had grown inches over the winter, his cheeks rosy and full of life. Clara scooped him up, resting him on her hip, her heart swelling with an unconditional love that had started in the snow and blossomed into an unbreakable bond. "Are you ready for the feast, little wolf?" Clara smiled, tapping his nose. "Father says I can have 2 honey tarts tonight," Leo declared proudly. "Does he now?" a deep, rumbling voice asked from the doorway. Cedric stepped onto the balcony, dressed in his ceremonial alpha regalia. He looked effortlessly powerful, but as his eyes landed on Clara and Leo, the harshness of the warlord melted away entirely. He walked over, wrapping his massive arms around both of them, burying his face in Clara's neck and inhaling deeply. "You look beautiful," Cedric murmured against her skin. My prime, my Luna. Clara leaned into his solid chest, looking out over the pack that now revered her, not out of fear, but out of profound respect. She had started as a broken servant, meant to die nameless in the snow. But fate and 8 drops of alpha blood had rewritten her destiny. Come, Clara said softly, taking Cedric's hand while holding Leo in her other arm. Our people are waiting. Together, the 3 of them walked down to the courtyard, stepping into the sunlight to lead the Ashbourne pack into a new, golden era. What a wild, breathtaking ride. Clara's incredible journey from a disgraced, broken Omega to a legendary Prime Alpha female proves that true strength isn't determined by your bloodline, but by the courage in your heart and the sacrifices you are willing to make for those you love. Genevieve's brutal betrayal and satisfying downfall were pure cinematic drama. If you loved this epic tale of werewolf romance, shocking twists, and ultimate redemption, do not forget to like this video, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories. Stay wild,